Bildad the Shuhite insists that Job is living proof that the light of the wicked goes out in death. And yet Job insists that he's been wronged, and no one listens to his cries for help. Let's open the Bible and think on these things. This is the Word of Truth Ministry video library. I am Nathan C. Johnson, Bible teacher. I greet you in the faith and fellowship of our great God and Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ, whose we are, whom we love, and whom we serve. Let's open our Bibles to the book of Job. And we are on chapter 18, which is where Bildad the Shuhite makes his second address to Job. Now we saw in their first set of arguments that each one of Job's friends took a line. Eliphaz was all about human experience, Bildad about human tradition, and so far about human merit. And that's seen, I think, most clearly in their first arguments. It begins to break down and they all begin to sound kind of the same in their second and third addresses. But here we go again with Bildad, the one who, at least the first time, was about human tradition. Job 18:1, then answered Bildad the Shuhite and said, then verse 2, and I'll be reading once again from Bullinger's metrical translation, wrote in a very poetic form, the book of Job. So Job 18 verse 2, how long will you thus hunt about for words? Pray understand, and after let us speak. So he accuses Job of just going on and on, of hunting about for words that he can use as arguments when really his words aren't good arguments or make good sense. So he says, how long? That's the Hebrew ad, which is their word for longest duration. Will you keep on for longest duration, as long as you possibly can, hunting about for words like you're doing? He says, pray understand. Job, you need to understand you're wrong. If you just think about it and understand you're wrong, well then once you realize that, then let us speak, because then what we say will make sense to you, Job. Verse 3, wherefore are we accounted like the beasts, and wherefore held as stupid in thine eyes? He says, it's not fair, Job. You're acting like we're animals with no reasoning ability. We're acting like we're stupid and have no understanding. Well, Job had a point, you have to admit. But Bildad whines about this. Verse 4, lo, in his anger 'tis himself he rends. For thee shall earth be rendered desolate? Or shall the rock be moved from its place? So he accuses Job of just tearing himself by his words, of rending his own soul, as it says in Hebrew. So he says, shall the earth, that's Hebrew eretz again, the earth or the very land itself, because empty, just because Job doesn't like what happened to him? So Bildad acts like their ideas and their opinions, the ideas and opinions and thoughts of he and his friends are just the foundation of everything. Why, the fact that good things happen to good people and bad things to bad people is just the foundation of everything. And if you remove those things, why, everything would be destroyed. Everything would just tumble down. If you insist that God isn't causing what's happening to you because you've done something wrong, Job, why, that just destroys everything and everything would fall apart. Well, he's not confident in his own view, is he? Verse 5, yes, true, the sinner's light shall be put out, and from his fire shall no bright flame ascend. So he insists, it's still true, Job, even though you say it's not, it's still true that the lights are going to go out of the house of sinners. And Bullinger says this refers to the universal practice of course, lighting lights at night. He says the lights of the sinners at night will be put out. And from their fires no bright flame shall ascend. Their fires will no longer burn. Meaning that they're not alive to light their lamps or light their fires. Verse 6, daylight shall darkness in his tent become. The lamp which hangs above him shall go out. So, in his tent, daylight shall become darkness. His tent, his tabernacle, his home is now darkness, of course, under the ground in the grave. And the lamps which hang above him shall go out. He and his family are all dead and no longer able to keep their lamps burning. And Bildad throughout here, like all his three friends, shows no compunction whatsoever against bringing up Job's dead family and just using him to really twist the knife into him as he argues against him. Verse 7, his once firm step shall halt and weakened be, and his own counsel cast him headlong down. So he says, the sinner like you, Job, he once had a firm step and he walked in confidence. And yet now, that step is weak and it's halt, it's feeble. He says, the counsels of the wicked one like you, Job, why his own counsels bring him to ruin. You thought, aha, I can do these wicked things and get away with them. But those counsels have brought you to ruin, Job. See? Verse 8, by his own feet he's urged into a net. For in his chosen way there lies a snare. So he says his own feet and the way he's walking has led him into a net. The way he lives has brought him into this trap. He says the sinner chooses the way of sin, and there's a snare there for all who travel that way, like you did, Job. You walked the way of sinners, and now you found out where that way leads. Verse 9, the hidden snare shall seize him by the heel. The noose shall catch him and shall hold him fast. So he says the hidden snare, the King James had the jinn. And jinn and our word ingenious come from the same thing. A jinn is an ingenious device. Same thing with our word engine. An engine is an ingenious device. But this Old English jinn just means a trap, an ingenious trap that's hidden. And then the noose catches and holds fast the sinner, just like it caught and hold fast Job. Verse 10, the snare lies hidden for him in the ground. The trap and ambush waits beside his path. So hidden for him in the ground is this snare. The Hebrew word is eretz. Again, hidden for him in the earth, in the land, is this snare. And then the trap is an ambush beside his path. Notice again what I've talked about before, the Hebrew poetry. English poetry, it's all about the repetition of sounds, generally, in meter. But Hebrew poetry, well, it may have meter, it goes off the repetition of ideas. Ideas are repeated over and over for emphasis, for poetic effect, instead of sounds being repeated over and over. Verse 11, terror shall startle him on every side. At every step they make his feet to start. So as these friends of Job wax eloquent, they again step back and look at him as the example of the kind of things that happen to the wicked. Now remember, Job had already admitted to being terrorized by dreams. That even his sleep isn't restful, because if he falls asleep, you think, well, he's sleeping, he could forget his calamity. Well, no. These horrifying dreams terrorize him when he sleeps. And he says, see, that's what happens to wicked people. Terrors startle him on every side. At every step they make his feet to start. So he says, see, Job, you're just the example of what happens to wicked people. Verse 12, through pangs of hunger shall his strength decline. A dire disease stands ready at his side. Now, Job admitted in his last answer to Eliphaz that his strength was declining through hunger. He mentioned his limbs and how emaciated they were. And now Bildad uses that as the illustration of the kind of things that happens to wicked people. Yes, their strength declines through hunger. See, Job, that's what's happening to you. That's what happens to wicked people. A dire disease stands ready at his side. Of course, Job has this terrible disease. And he says that's what happens to wicked people. The disease is ready at their side. Now, side here is tselah. And it's the same word that's translated rib in Genesis 2, where it says that God took a rib out of Adam and made it into the woman, Isha. But that's the only place the word is ever translated rib. Elsewhere it's translated side, and I've actually argued it means that God took the female side out of Adam, who contained both sides in the beginning. But anyway, it's not that a dire disease stands ready at his rib. It stands ready at his side. Verse 13, the members of his body to consume. Yea, death's firstborn his members shall devour. So he says this disease stands ready to consume the members of his body. Job pointed out how his members were emaciated, and he says, yep, see, that's what happens to the wicked. A dire disease is ready to consume his members, like is what happened to you, Job. And then death's firstborn devours his members. What does that mean, death's firstborn? Say, wait, death has a firstborn? What would death give birth to? Well, understand that in their society, the firstborn was the chief, the ruler, the one with the sovereignty, the one who was going to take the position of patriarch after his father couldn't do it anymore. That was the firstborn. And so death's firstborn would be the chief death, the ruling death. Bullinger suggests perhaps it means the very cruelest kind of death. Devours his members. Verse 14, uproot him from his tent in which he trusts, and to the king of terrors hurries him. So disease and death's sovereignty over him is going to uproot him from his home, from his tabernacle. And the king of terrors is going to hurry him along his way to his destruction. Now the king of terrors there is a euphemism, a nice way of putting something rather than just saying it starkly and bluntly. And of course the euphemism is for death. Death is the king of terrors. Everything you could be afraid of. What would be the ultimate cause of the fear? Well, generally that you're going to die. That's the king of terrors. That's the most terrifying thing of all. Well, maybe to the righteous it isn't. But for people whom their life centers around themselves, certainly death is the king of terrors, no doubt about it. But verse 15, these terrors in his tent shall dwell, yet not his own. Brimstone upon it shall descend. So he says, all death's terrors shall live with him. Again, I think he's referencing Job's admission that he's terrorized at night in his dreams. So he says, yes, terrors live and dwell in the tent with the wicked man, although it's not really his tent anymore. He's lost the whole thing. Notice he's again driving it into Job, screwing the knife into him. And then he says, brimstone shall descend upon his tent. And remember, perhaps he's referring to how fire fell and burned up some of Job's flocks. Fire from heaven fell and destroyed them. Again, one of the clear signs that what happened to Job was supernatural. And they all took it as a sign that what happened to Job was from God. Of course, we realize that the supernatural power that was behind what happened to Job was the power of Satan, but they all saw it as the power of God. Brimstone upon his house shall descend. The house of the wicked, like you, Job. See? Brimstone descended on your house. That's what happens to wicked people. Verse 16, well, from beneath his root shall be dried up, and from above his branch shall be cut off. So he compares him to a tree. What would happen to a tree whose roots were cut off below and branches were cut off above? Well, that tree would die, no doubt about it. A tree can't live without its roots or its branches. That would bring the plant to an end. So he says that's what happens to the wicked. Now, interestingly, the word cut off here is the same word that's often translated circumcised in the Bible. And circumcision, of course, is a cutting off. And in Hebrew, that's what the word means, cut off. So his branch is cut off. His branch is circumcised, we might say. Verse 17, his memory has perished from the earth. No name is left to him in all the land. So his memory has perished. The Hebrew is abad, from which we get abaddon, destruction. But his memory, his reputation, we might say, has perished from the earth. That's eretz, or land. No name is left to him in all the land. The name, again, means the reputation. And again, we have this indication that Job was very famous. Job was a famous man. If he wasn't a king and a ruler, he was at least a very powerful, very famous man. But he says no name is left to him. All his reputation is shot. Your reputation is shot after what happened to you, Job. Everyone thinks like we do that you did something to deserve this. Verse 18, from light to darkness do they thrust him forth, and from the world they drive him far away. So he says, people drive you out, Job, when they see what happened to you. And they probably do. They figure Job is somehow cursed, and lest the curse fall on them too. They say, get out of here, Job. I don't want to have anything to do with you after what happened to you. I don't want God treating me like he treated you. They drive him far away from the world. That's the Hebrew tabel, meaning the inhabited world. The world is dwelt in by human beings. He says, the inhabited world of human beings doesn't want anything to do with you, Job. They want you out. Verse 19, childless among his people he is left. In all his habitation none survives. Again, how heartless Bildad is in pointing out to Job the death of his children. He just drives the knife home. He shall have neither son nor nephew among his people, it says in the King James Version. And that means offspring or posterity, or maybe children or grandchildren. And of course, Job's hope would have been that his children would have led to grandchildren. But again, he cruelly references their fate. No grandchildren for you, Job. Your children are all dead. None of your family is alive. That's what happens to wicked people. Well, of course, his wife was still alive, but we already said she did him little good. She said, curse God and die, Job. She wasn't there to help him. She'd given up. So he counts that none of his family is left alive. His wife, but who cares about her? She's abandoned him. Verse 20, they who come after wonder at his doom, as they who went before were seized with fear. Now his doom there, in Hebrew, that's actually his day. Those who come after, who see what happened to him, they wonder, wow, that such a day would come upon a man like Job. Such a fate, such a doom. And those who went before, who are in his presence, they're seized with fear. And is Bildad admitting here that he's a little fearful himself? What happened to Job is making him a bit afraid? I think there's no doubt about it. His friends are afraid. They're afraid that if they admit that what happened to Job wasn't deserved, there's nothing to keep it from happening to them. I think that's why they're so insistent. Job, you must have deserved it, because something like this doesn't happen to a good person. And it could never happen to me. Verse 21, such are the dwellings of all wicked men, yea, such the place of him who knows not God. So his conclusion, he just steps back and looks at Job again and says, yes, Job, you must be wicked. Because the dwellings of wicked men always end up like yours. What? Empty and childless. That's the place of those who don't know El, the mighty God. Their place is with you, Job. They end up just like you. Well, what a comforting and helpful address Bildad's second address was. How much Job surely appreciated it. Well, we'll see how much Job appreciates it. Let's go right on to chapter 19 and see Job's reply to Bildad's second address. Job 19, verse 1, then Job answered and said, so Job replies to Bildad, he's not left speechless. Verse 2, how long will ye thus grieve and vex my soul, and break me all to pieces with your words? So he says, are you just keep going on and on, grieving and vexing my soul? And soul here, I think there's no doubt about it, it means me, myself. He's putting his soul for himself. And break me all to pieces with your words? I mean, how emotionally painful their words must have been to Job. Like I said, it was like he was taking the knife and driving it into Job and twisting it. When he mentions the death of his children, the emptiness of his house, that none of his children are left alive. And how heartless Bildad is. How cruel. I wonder, what was the look on his face as he said these things to Job? What did his face look like? He just says, you break me to pieces with your words. You grieve my soul. My emotions are just so hurt by what you're saying. Verse 3, already 10 times have ye taunted me, and still are not ashamed to wrong me thus. Well, we've seen they've only given 5 addresses, Eliphaz and Bildad 2, and so far 1. But maybe he's counting their taunts, specific taunts. Or maybe by 10 times he just means many times, because certainly they've been taunting him on in the things they've been saying. He says, you've done me wrong, and you ought to be ashamed, and yet you're not ashamed. You should be ashamed to treat me like you're treating me in your words. Verse 4, be it that I have sinned, as ye say, my sense of sin abideth with myself. So he says, if it's true that I've sinned, like you say I've sinned, well, wouldn't I have some sense of that sin in myself? Wouldn't I know, wouldn't I realize that I've sinned? Wouldn't I have some clue about what that sin was? How come I have no clue about what this sin you keep talking about is? If I'm really such a bad sinner as you say, how come I don't know what the sin is that caused all this? Verse 5, if against me still ye magnify yourselves, and plead against me that I must have sinned. So he says, if you're still going to make yourselves righteous and insist that I'm wicked and insist that I must have done something to deserve this. Verse 6, then know ye that Eloah hath o'erthrown my cause, and made his net to close me round. So he insists that Eloah, the venerable God, the God who deserves to be worshipped, he's the one who's done this to me, Job says. He's the one who's overthrown my cause. He's the one who's closed me in a net. It's not that I've been walking down this wicked way and walked into a net. It's that Eloah sprung this net on me as I was walking in the righteous way. Well, once again, it was really Satan who sprung this net on him. Verse 7, behold, I cry out, wrong, but am not heard. I cry out, help, but there is no redress. So again, he's insisting he's wrong, and he cries for help, and yet no help comes. He insists that this is wrong, and yet no one listens to him. No one helps him. And he says there's no judgment. That's the Hebrew mishpat, which means there's no setting in order. There's no setting me back in order. I'm just left in the state I don't deserve to be in. Verse 8, my path he hedgeth up, I cannot pass, and on my way he maketh darkness rest. So he says, this pathway I've been walking along, Bildad, that you say I've been walking on, he says God took and hedged it up. He hedged it in. Suddenly I had nowhere to go. There was just a hedge in front of me. No place to go. I can't pass. And then on my way he made darkness rest. I look around where else I can go, and I'm just in darkness. I can't see any way to go. You say, well, I just follow the way I say and everything will be right for you, Job. He says, I can't see any way to go. I've done what was right and this happened to me. So where do I go from here? Verse 9, from me my glory he hath stripped it off, and from my head hath he removed the crown. So he says that God took and stripped my glory off of me, like stripping off the clothes, of course. Now what's glory? I think this word glory is a word that has come to be just about meaningless. In fact, people will shout glory in a service in certain emotional churches, and they don't mean much more than that they're excited. But see, glory in the Bible is not a worthless word like that. It means esteem or honor or value. He says he's stripped off all esteem, all honor from me. He's pulled it off of me. And from my head hath he removed the crown. Head is the Hebrew rosh. It's the top part of the body. And notice that the crown is used here as parallel with his glory, his esteem. He stripped off his glory, he's removed his crown. So maybe crown just refers to the esteem he was held in by many people. But I can't help but think, does this indicate, again, as we've seen hints at elsewhere, that Job was actually a king, that he was actually a ruler? And yet now he says, the crown has been removed from my head. Verse 10, on all sides I am crushed. Where'er I go, he hath my hope uprooted like a tree. So he says, I'm surrounded and I'm crushed on all sides. Well, he had been. His servants, all his animals, his wealth, his children, his health, and the love of his wife, everything has been stripped from him. Everything. He's been crushed everywhere he looks. He says his hope, his expectation for a future has been uprooted like a tree pulled out of the ground. Verse 11, against me he hath made his anger burn, and counts me toward him as his enemy. Of course, by he means God here. And everything that has happened to him seems to indicate to him that God is angry with him, that God is furious at him and counting him as his enemy and causing all this to happen to him. Now we know from having seen the beginning of Job that the reality is that it was Satan. Satan was Job's enemy, no doubt about it. Satan was Job's enemy. And Satan hated Job, and it's Satan who had sprung all this on him. And yet, over and over, Job and his friends assume that it's God, not Satan, doing this to Job. And I would point out that even today, many continue to confuse the results of Satan's wicked and destructive actions with God. Satan's great power in this world, they think is God's power in this world, so they get this polyglot picture of God is looking partially like God and partially like Satan. Maybe mostly like Satan. Well, it's the same thing here with Job and his friends. They assume that God did all this when really it was Satan. Verse 12, together against me do his troops come on. Against me they their earthworks have cast up, and round about my tent have they encamped. So he describes God as calling out his army to go after Job. And his army throws up their earthworks against him. Now, understand this is describing the actions of an army when it comes to attack a city. What do? They throw up earthworks. They try to throw dirt and make a mound against the wall that they can then climb and get over the wall being the protection of the city. Why, when they mount up earthworks against the wall, they can then climb that and get into the city and attack it. And round about my tent have they encamped. An army would encamp around a city to cut that city off so no food or help can get into the city. And so he says, God has done this to me. He's treating me like a besieged enemy city. Verse 13, my brethren hath he put far off from me, and mine acquaintance from me are estranged. So his brethren, his relatives, which Job no doubt had relatives. I mean, he has his family, his wife and children, but no doubt he also had siblings, maybe even parents that were still alive, a family. And yet he says that these are all afar off. They've abandoned him. He said, we don't want anything to do with Job and what happened to him. And then his acquaintances, everyone he knew, as we would say, they all have become estranged from him. They don't want to come anywhere near Job. They don't want anything to do with what's happened to him. Verse 14, my near of kin have ceased and failed me, and my familiar friends forgotten me. So his nearest kinsmen, like his wife, for example, you don't get much nearer than the wife, and yet they've all failed him. They've all said, Job, we give up. You're on your own. Forget it. Like his wife said, if you want to maintain your integrity with God, forget it. I think you should curse him and die. I don't want anything to do with you if you're going to keep trusting God after all this. And then his familiar friends, his closest friends. He says they've forgotten him. I think, again, it's in case that what happened to Job could happen to them. They don't want anything to do with him. Verse 15, the dwellers in my house, the very maids, account and treat me as a stranger now. I am become an alien in their eyes. So he describes those who are part of his household, not his family, but part of his household. Job, being as wealthy and powerful as he was, probably had many household slaves. And the male ones would always have been in higher positions than the female ones, and yet even the female servants, even the maid servants from his house, why they now treat him like a stranger and a foreigner. And they no longer look at him as, oh, that's my master. I have to do what he says. I have to honor and respect him. No, they look at him like a foreigner. Nobody really has any respect for foreigners in those days. I mean, your life was dependent upon your people, but people who weren't your people, you just looked at it with hatred and suspicion. That's a foreigner. And he says, that's how my female servants treat me now, with hatred and suspicion. They want nothing to do with me. Verse 16, I called my servant, but he answered not, though I entreated him with mine own mouth. So his servants wouldn't obey his command or answer his call. You'd expect the servant to jump at the words from his master's mouth, and yet his servants don't respond to anything he says. They don't want nothing to do with him. Verse 17, my breath is grown offensive to my wife. So would my fondling to my sons appear. So he says his breath, in Hebrew that's ruach, his spirit. But spirit in the Bible is often connected with the breath. And he says that my spirit is grown offensive to my wife. In Hebrew that's isha, his woman. Hebrew had no separate word for woman and wife. So you call your wife my woman, and she would call her husband my man, because that's the only terminology they had. They didn't have husband and wife. But he says, my very spirit, my very life is just offensive to my woman, to my wife. So would my fondling to my sons appear. So she acts toward me like my sons might act to my fondling. Now this could be someone he thought to adopt, and they would say, you're going to give some of our inheritance to someone else? They wouldn't want anything to do with him. Or maybe like an illegitimate child. I don't think Job had an illegitimate child. He was a righteous man. But how would legitimate children treat an illegitimate? Well, when you mix the inheritance in there, they wouldn't want that to have anything to do with that illegitimate. So he says, my wife treats me like sons would treat a fondling, an adopted son, or an illegitimate son. We just want him out. He says, that's how my wife treats me. Verse 18, yea, even the very boys despise me now. They jeer at me when I attempt to rise. So he says the young boys, the young ne'er-do-wells, who once might have stood in awe at a mighty man like Job, they now mock him. They make fun of him. Ah, mister. They jeered him when he attempts to rise, when he tries to stand up, and he's so weak and tottering, and there's sores on his feet that hurt. These boys just laugh at him. Ha, 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 look at him. Ha, ha. Verse 19, my confidential friends from me recoil, and those I love turn right away from me. So his confidential friends, we would say his intimate friends, those he shared his closest thoughts and feelings with, those he really trusted, they now recoil from him. Well, I don't want anything to do with you, Job. Stay away from me. I don't want to get caught up in your fate. And those I love turn right away from me. Those he loved, that he genuinely loved, they turn from him. They want nothing to do with him. Well, his wife, of course, is a prime example, but others too. Verse 20, my bone cleaves fast onto my skin and flesh. All shrunk away the covering of my teeth. So he now describes his bones as sticking to his skin. He's probably referring again to his emaciated appearance. He's so emaciated that it's like his bones and his skin are stuck together, and there's nothing in between. And then he describes the covering of his teeth shrunk away. His gums shrunk away from his teeth. Again, Job probably looked a pretty hideous sight. Verse 21, have pity, oh have pity ye, my friends. A lowest hand, alas, hath stricken me. So he calls on his friends, have grace on me. Have grace on me, my friends. Have pity on me. Show me some favor. Show me a little concern here. The lowest hand, the venerable God, the one who deserves to be worshipped. His hand has struck me. Can't you have any compassion when you see what's happened to me? Verse 22, wherefore pursue me as if ye were God? Will not my body's ills suffice for you? He says, why are you chasing me just like the mighty God El? Just like he's chasing me. Well, again, it was Satan chasing him, but he thinks it's El. He says, why are you chasing me along with El? Well, they're really chasing him along with Satan is what they're doing. Satan's using them as his agents. He says, aren't my body's ills enough for you? Aren't I sick enough in body that you have to try to make me sick in spirit by your accusations and your mockery? Now, Job for a moment turns from his friends. And he seems to ask himself now, do I really have any hope? In this situation, do I really have any hope? Is it really true I have no hope? Verse 23, oh, that my words could now be written down. Oh, that a record could be graved with pen. Job wishes that what happened to him could be written down. And look, his wish has come true in this book. In the book of Job, what happened to him has been written down. And we have it recorded for our learning even today. Now, perhaps no stenographer was there to take down Job's words or the words of his friends. Maybe there was. But Job doesn't seem to realize it or think that there was. And yet, even if no one was taking down their words and writing down their argument, the Holy Spirit was there. And he could record and he could remember everything that was said. That a record could be graved with pen. Verse 24, of iron, cut in rock and filled with lead, a witness evermore. The words are these. So he wants his words to be written with an iron pen cut into rock. Of course, writing on paper is temporary because paper doesn't last. And yet if you chiseled words into a rock, and then even more than that, then filled lead and let it harden into those words, why then that would be a permanent writing. As permanent as you can get it. Much more permanent. That would be a witness evermore. The Hebrew is odd, a witness to longest duration, far, far out into the future of what's happened to me. And then these are the words he wants to be written. Verse 25, I know that my Redeemer ever lives, and that the latter day on earth shall stand. So Job says, everyone's saying that I am a wicked man who deserve this, yet this is what I say. I know that my Redeemer lives. Now, Redeemer here is the Hebrew Ga'al. And Ga'al is a very important name for the kinsman Redeemer that God set up in his Old Testament law, and that we have the great example of in Boaz in the book of Ruth, being the kinsman redeemer of Ruth and her mother-in-law Naomi. Now Boaz and the kinsman redeemer is a great picture of Christ, our Gaal, our kinsman redeemer, our one who's going to redeem us from sin and death. And Job, referring to his redeemer, is referring to Jehovah, is referring to Christ. And he believes, in spite of all that's happened to him, he still believes that Christ is his redeemer. He still believes in God. He says, I know that my Gaal, my redeemer, lives. And at the latter day, now there's no word for day here, in the latter time, or in the after time. And that means the time after the resurrection in the kingdom of God. He says, I know in the aftertime on earth, my Gaal shall stand. Earth there is soil, as in Genesis 2:7, the material of which our bodies are made. He'll stand on the soil. My Gaal, my Redeemer. And Jesus Christ did stand on the soil to come and redeem all from their sins, to redeem even Job by his death on the cross. And he will stand on the soil yet again in his second coming. Verse 26, and after worms this body have consumed, yet in my flesh I shall Eloah see. So he says, even though I know I'm going to die and worms consume my body, I still know I'm going to see Eloah in my flesh. Now, could a stronger statement of belief in resurrection be made? Job has made a strong statement of his faith in resurrection. His sad death that seemed to him approaching so near, and though it wasn't as near as he thought, it did eventually come. Why, that death, Job knows, will not be the end of him, and it wasn't the end of him. Though Job has been dead these many thousands of years, yet someday Job will be back in his flesh. And someday he will see Eloah, the venerable God himself, in his flesh, raised from the dead. Verse 27, whom e'en I shall see upon my side. Mine eye shall see him, stranger now no more. For this my inmost soul with longing waits. So Job emphasizes, I am going to see him. I am going to see him. And I'll see him on my side. I won't see him being my enemy and pouring out wrath on me anymore like he's doing now. I won't see him acting like a stranger, acting like he doesn't know me and wants nothing to do with me. He won't be a stranger anymore. He'll be there for me. We'll be together. And he says his soul, his inmost organs is the Hebrew word. His inmost organs are longing for this time. My gut, just in my gut, I long for this time when I'll be raised from the dead and I and Eloah will be together. Now he speaks of his three friends and what will happen to them in that time. Verse 28, ye shall then say, why did we him pursue? Why seek to find in him a root of blame? So he says, you'll be there raised from the dead, and you'll be disagreeing with your past actions. You'll be wondering, why did we treat Job this way? How could we have been so foolish? Well, Job was right. His friends, I think, did live to regret what they said of Job, and will yet in resurrection. Verse 29, beware, and of the sword be ye afraid, for wrathful are the sword's dread punishments, and ye shall know indeed its judgment sure. So he warns these friends of his, you're risking punishment by these things you're saying. You're risking the sword's condemnation, the sword's punishment. And he says, you will know its condemnation. The word is repeated for emphasis. Judgment there. It's not the typical word for judgment, but it is a word repeated. A sure judgment. You'll know its judging judgments. You'll know its condemnation, its sure condemnation for the things you've said about me. So in this portion, Bildad insists that Job's arguments would destroy the foundations of everything, and insists on the truth that the sinner's lamps will go out in death, and a trap will be found in his way, even as happened to Job. People abandon the sinner and drive him out, just as happened to Job. Yet Job points out he ought to know he's done wrong, if anyone would know it. He insists God has overthrown him wrongly, yet no one will hear his cry for help. His friends have abandoned him and his family distanced themselves far from him. Why do they have no pity? Yet even now in the situation he's in, Job insists his Redeemer lives. And he believes someday in resurrection, he will see him on his side and no longer treating him like a stranger. Then his friends will regret how they treated him. Don't they fear punishment for their actions? Well, Job rises above his situation here and shows great faith. And I think anyway, applaud Job in what he said here. What words to say in such a horrible situation. Job's faith rises above in this and states the truth. And yet, sadly, his friends are not impressed. And Zophar will speak up and give his second address. And of course, he rejects the truths that Job said. So if you've enjoyed what we've discussed today, please press like below. And until we meet again around the pages of God's book, I bid you goodbye.